get started. I'm Paul Saunders, the Executive Director of the Center for the National Interest. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining us today for what we hope will be an informative and an interesting conversation about Russia's information efforts. We called it in our invitation. I think we've got two really terrific speakers with, I think, different but complementary backgrounds, both with extensive experience in the intelligence community. To my left, our first speaker, Dr. Eric Haseltine, who is actually a neuroscientist, but also a former chief technology officer at the National Security Agency. I got that correct, I hope. And also a recipient of the National Intelligence Distinguished Service Medal. Someone with really very extensive experience at the intersection of technology and intelligence, both in the private sector and also in government. To my right, we have my new colleague, George Beebe, who's the Director of the Intelligence and National Security Program here at the Center for the National Interest, a career intelligence professional who had been an advisor to Vice President Cheney on Russian matters and also on intelligence issues. After that, the Director of Russian Analysis at the Central Intelligence Agency. George, after his time in government service, also developing some important private sector experience related to technology and how people influence one another on the internet, if I can put it that way. So I'd like to ask each of our speakers to speak for 10 minutes to get us started. Then we'll open it up for questions and discussion. And Dr. Haseltine, if we can start with you, please.
Well, I think I'd like to start at 100,000 feet before getting into the details of the Russian information operations in this country. I believe that it's not too much of a stretch to say that the Russians view us in many senses as an adversary. And I think that it's also safe to say that they have a different view of conflict than we do, whereas we tend to think of it more in terms of warfare. They think of it more broadly, where they don't distinguish so much between conflict and not conflict. You have to remember what Clausewitz said about war, that it is the achievement of political aims through violence. And you have to keep that in front of you always, that the end objective is political. So whether you get it through violence or whether you get it through hacking or whether you get it through buying Facebook ads, as far as the Russians are concerned, the end objective is what they always keep in mind. And so just some context, if you look at the economies of the two countries, Russia's gross domestic product is roughly that of Texas. So if you do a thought experiment and imagine that you were Texas and the rest of the your adversary was the United States, and I'm not saying anything negative about Texas. I love Texas. But I'm just using that as a reference. You think about the scale of things. So your adversary is the United States, and you have the economy of Texas. What do? You start there. And what you do is several things. One, you want to avoid conflict against your opponent's strength at all costs. They're going to beat you on the battlefield in conventional warfare. You don't want to fight them. So you want to do everything you can to avoid that while still achieving your political objective. The second thing is that if you do have to fight them, you want to win. And it isn't a given that the superior numbers and the superior economy is going to win. If one adversary is very clever about developing spikes of capability that exactly align with the weakness of a strong adversary, they will beat them. And I don't think anybody would argue that the great Achilles heel of our military apparatus is the fact that we are so dependent on the network. And so if the network goes down, it's very difficult for us to fight. So it should come as no surprise that there may be no one better in the world at network warfare than the Russians. And the reason that they're so good is very simple, is that they have to be. So I think that it's important to have that kind of 100,000-foot view of what's happening now, because I think it puts into context what we're seeing. So if the Russians view us as adversaries, then it's fair game to engage in what they call information confrontation without armed conflict. Because remember, they're trying to achieve political aims. So now let's turn to some of the more recent things that you've heard about with Facebook, for example, in that context. A lot has been said about the Russian activities in the 2016 election and how they were trying to favor one candidate over another. But clearly that can't be the only story. For one thing, the Facebook campaign was continuing until August of this year. We know this. Facebook has acknowledged this. And when you look at the content of the Facebook, yes, some of it advantaged one candidate, but more generally its aim was to divide our society on multiple levels. There were divisive statements on race, on energy, on guns, on just about every latent crack in our society that we have. Pressure was applied through those ads surgically. And so if you look at it from that point of view, the larger aim was to weaken an adversary by heightening already existing internal dissension. Because a weakened adversary who is fighting themselves is less likely to fight you. Or if they do fight you, they're not going to do it with the same will. You know, Clausewitz also said that the aim of war is not to defeat a military. The aim of war is to remove the will to fight from your adversary. And that's the key phrase, will to fight. If there is internal dissension in an adversary, then their will to fight is less, and their ability to fight when they fight is less. And so I think that that is the context in which I would put what has been happening. And I think that the prediction of my point of view is that this is going to continue for the foreseeable future. I suspect the sanctions are not going to produce meaningful movement in this direction. And one of the reasons that I believe that is that I'm not going to say with certainty that the Russians wanted us to know that they were behind some of these things that were happening. But I think one thing that we have to keep in mind is that it's possible that they did. Or at a very minimum, they weren't too concerned about us learning that it was their hand in the DNC hack, in the Facebook ads, and in the other things that have been happening. And you say, well, why on earth would they not be concerned about their hand being found in this, or even want us to know, or the rest of the world? And that is a fascinating question. I do not pretend to be a policy person. I'm a techno-geek spy, right? I'm not really a policy person. But to me, I think we do have to look at that possibility. And it takes you in fascinating directions. Was this a deterrent? It is well-known principle of deterrence that if you don't really have the weapon and you can't prove that it works, that it's not a deterrent. Was this a show of force? Was this a warning of some kind that if you mess with us, we're going to mess with you? I don't know. But I think that is an aspect of this whole evolution that I suspect, because I will say this, that the Russians are very, very skilled in network operations. When it is their intention to hide what they're doing, I suspect they're about as good at it as anybody. And when you look at the tradecraft that is reported in the press, it doesn't, I think, live up to the standards of some things that they are probably capable of. So I think that's one kind of interesting dimension of this that we should think about. Is there a meta message to us and to the rest of the world and to the Russian people in these activities that have been going on? So I think I will end there and turn it over to my colleague, George.
Thank you very much. George, take it away.
Great. Thank you. So I'd like to start out by doing something that I think is fairly rare at events like this, and that is to quote Taylor Swift, the popular singer. I'm about to make my 12-year-old daughter very happy. But that's not why I'm quoting Taylor Swift. So the quote is, haters gonna hate. Very well-known expression. Now, why do I raise that? Because behind that thought is actually a fairly big idea. It's one that Graham Allison, of course, famously cited in his study of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the organizational process model. It's the idea that sometimes when governments do things, there is central direction, there's a unitary rational actor pursuing coherent strategic objectives. Sometimes it's parts of government that are operating according to their normal organizational processes. They're doing the things they're paid to do. And what we're seeing is not the product of an elaborate strategic plan, it's a process of routine business as usual. And that is very relevant to the question that we're facing today here. We have a fairly interesting picture of what's gone on in the Facebook and Twitter advertising purchases, the messages that were targeted at very particular portions of our population in very specific geographic areas. Do we look at this as part of a grand Kremlin plan with very specific objectives toward the United States? Do we look at this as the result of lower level, working level activities among Russians that is fairly routine, or is it something in between? So I would like to argue that it's actually probably something in between, but I will caution that there's still a lot we don't know about this, and we ought to be careful about drawing conclusions so early in this process. So I'd like to tell you why I think that's the case. But before I get into that, I want to point out a common cognitive trap that we can all fall into as we address questions like this, and that's confirmation bias. It's very easy to start with a hypothesis, an explanation for what's going on, then go out and do research to see if you can find information that's consistent with that hypothesis. And when you go about doing things like that, you usually find evidence that's consistent with your hypothesis. The trap that you can run into, though, is that you're not looking at alternative explanations that are also consistent with that very same evidence. And in this particular case, the hypothesis that the Kremlin directed an influence operation campaign in the United States that is designed to play upon disunity, to sow dissension within the United States, and ultimately, as some have phrased this, to destroy our democracy and the broader liberal international order. There is evidence that is consistent with that. I would say, though, that that same evidence is also consistent with other explanations, including the haters gonna hate model. Influence operators are gonna influence, that's what they do. And also with explanations that fall in between those two extremes. I want to offer an alternative look at this, a little bit different paradigm, just as a thought exercise. It goes like this. As Russia sunk deeper and deeper into political and economic and societal dysfunction during the 1990s, and as they watched NATO moving eastward, Russians began to think that maybe this wasn't an accident. Maybe the hordes of American experts that were coming over there providing advice on reforms that they ought to pursue actually wanted to see Russia sink deeper and deeper into dysfunction. That this was a grand design on our part to finish our enemy off, to complete the unfinished business of that Cold War defeat. And then as time went by, social media and the internet became more and more influential. We started having color revolutions in the former Soviet Union, movements in the Middle East, the so-called Arab Spring, that seemed to be very much related to social media messaging. The Kremlin began to get very, very worried that all of this was pointing toward a US-directed regime change effort that would very prominently feature social media as well as other things. And they started to take action to defend themselves. You started seeing a lot of activity inside Russia to get a handle on social media influence. So-called troll factories were created, where they employed thousands of people to go out and post things in this medium, comment on blogs and other posts online, take out advertising, create message campaigns of their own. This became very, very common inside Russia. A lot of people were employed doing this. A lot of money was spent in this area. And this gradually moved from inside Russia out into the world more broadly, including into the United States.
What years would you describe this process?
The mid-2000s and on. Now, question here is what we're seeing with these advertising purchases in Facebook and Twitter the product of these troll factories going out there and doing what they've been doing for years, business as usual? And I would point out that the methodology that appears to be being used that links these ad buys to Russians, much of it is linked to what we know about one of these very prominent troll factories, which has gone by a number of different names, but I think the most noteworthy is the Internet Research Agency, which is operating in St. Petersburg. We can trace some of these ad buys to people connected to that group. These are not highly trained intelligence professionals. For the most part, these are people that need jobs, that are being paid on quota to go out and post things. They're rewarded for high productivity and going out and posting these things. They get some broad guidance as to what they ought to be doing, but not a lot of day-to-day specificity in the direction about what they're up to. And what we're seeing, I think, is not inconsistent with the picture that I'm talking about. Now, do I know for sure that it's A and not B? No, I don't. What I can say, though, is that both of these explanations for the evidence that we've got in front of us fit with what we know so far. The best way to ensure that you're not falling into the confirmation bias trap on this is actually to look for disconfirming evidence, things that can rule out some hypotheses. For example, if your belief here is that this is a Kremlin-directed effort aimed at undermining U.S. democracy, ultimately bringing about our demise as an adversary, what would you expect to see beyond the evidence that we've got so far? And I would submit there that we don't have disconfirming evidence, things that rule out that hypothesis, but we aren't seeing some things that we would expect to see if the Russians were really trying to bring our democracy down. For example, it is well within Russia's cyber capabilities to do things like turn out the lights, at least temporarily, in parts of our country, things that may not have necessarily a crippling effect on our business operations, but would have a profound psychological effect on our sense of security. Wall Street trading is another one. That's one that could be highly disruptive, and not only psychologically there. And it's interesting that we haven't seen that. In the area of elections, a lot has been made about the probes that have gone on in state electoral systems there. There's a little bit of confusion as to what actually occurred there, and I'm not sure we've got all the facts yet as to what actually went on. But I think there's a general sense right now that they did not mess with the actual tallying of the votes. And even if they didn't mess with the actual tallying of the votes, I think it's fair to say they didn't do anything that would suggest to us, that would try to deceive us into believing that the vote system was messed with. And even if you don't have the ability physically to change the vote counts, and that's a debatable proposition, they certainly have the ability to deceive us into thinking they did. And so far we haven't seen that, which you would expect to see if that hypothesis were really what's driving the Russians right now. Now, do I have anything that rules out the organizational process explanation, the haters gonna hate theory? No. But I think there's one thing that I would do that could test it. And I think right now it might be in the U.S. interest to try to test it. If the Russians are trying to do some things that would get our attention, that would cause us to say, you know what, all the things that the Russians suspect we've been doing inside Russia, supporting opposition movements, trying to hasten democratic reform that they find very alarming. If what they're really trying to do is to show that they can do things here to get us to knock it off, we can test that proposition. Just this past week, during his first meeting with newly confirmed U.S. Ambassador to Russia, John Huntsman, Putin actually mentioned principles that he thought should guide the bilateral relationship. One of them was mutual non-interference in the internal affairs of the other side. We could look at that and say, this is a bluff. It doesn't really mean that. But we could test it too. We could pursue that and see. If the Russians' goal really is to bring down our democracy as opposed to get us to change our behavior toward them, they shouldn't bite on this. You know, they may play this out, play for time, but actually reaching a deal we shouldn't see if that hypothesis is true. And I think that's one that we ought to investigate, because personally I suspect that this is something that they would be interested in pursuing. So I will leave it at that.
Thank you very much,
Can I
George.
respond to
Please,
something?
please do, Eric.
You know, the thing that I learned in the intel business is when you see something bad happening, you can attribute it to malice or incompetence. And 99% of the time, incompetence is a better bet. And I won't say that what George is saying about, is it incompetent that the Russian information organs got a little ahead of perhaps where the policymakers were. I think that is a possibility. Except in the case of the Russians, I don't think that's the case. And I would kind of contest a little bit something that George said, where, are we looking for evidence that the Russians are trying to take down our democracy? I think that's a little bit of a straw man that's too extreme. I don't think in their heart of hearts they really think they're going to be able to do that. I think they maybe have much less ambitious goals, which nonetheless would also explain what we're seeing. In military affairs, we have denial, which is to deny us our democratic government, and then there's the notion of degradation. And I think the Russians are smart enough to know that extreme begets extreme. If they really did do, as you say, to take down our SCADA systems, what we call the command and control of our infrastructure, then I think that that would be viewed as something that would engender a kinetic response, because that's a kinetic effect, as we say in the military. So I think that my own view is that the Russians have a kind of a degradation strategy, and that's what we're seeing. And that, interestingly, I'll just close my comment in saying that I have seen from our side when we have been incompetent and we've screwed up, and then we take a step back and look at what we did. We said, yes, we shouldn't have done that, but we did it, so how do we exploit it? And I interpret some of the things that are going on right now on the other side in that context, that whether or not that was their original intent, that's kind of where we've gotten into. And if you look back on the world stage and you say, well, how does the rest of the world view what's going on? At a very minimum, you'd have to say that they look at Russia as punching above their weight with all of this. And does that hurt Russia? My own view is they would rather be feared than liked. And so it has served their interest.
George, perhaps you want to respond.
A quick response on that. I think your views and mine on this, Eric, are not all that far apart. I think the difficulty that we're in right now is that the public discussion of this has been extreme. We're told that we are at war, for example, by Morgan Freeman and company, that Russia is in fact seeking to destroy our democracy and undermine the liberal international order. And that's actually something that we've been told by official U.S. intelligence community analysis on this, which has offered actually two contrasting explanations for what we've seen since the election One, that the Russians were trying to elect President Trump. The other, that they were trying to undermine our democracy and the broader international order. And I think the reality of what we're dealing with is a little bit more nuanced than that. And I think you have pointed out some of those nuances which are important to consider.
And I would just respond that I don't really think, honestly, that the Russians care that much whether we have a democracy or not. I think what they care about is, are we going to mess with them in some way and get in way of their policy aims, whatever our ideology?
Yes, I quite agree.
Yeah, so I think they're somewhat apolitical in that sense, that they have a larger agenda which they more care about us from a pragmatic point of view than an ideological point of view, except as it relates to their own population and how they view true democracy or not.
Let's go first to our president here at the Center for the National Interest, Dimitri Saunders.
I completely agree with Eric that the issue for the Russians is probably not American democracy. After all, the Russians have perfectly good relations with such good democracies as India, Brazil, and I would say Israel. Whatever differences the Russians have with Israelis, it's over issues on the ground in Syria and Lebanon, not quality of Israeli democracy. But I think that we, George, Paul, and myself, together with the Center delegation, were just in Russia, where we talked to Russian officials and had some very vigorous conversations about the interference issue, which my impression is the Russians still do not take sufficiently seriously and do not quite understand that blanket denials on their part would not be sufficient. I think that it's very clear to most of us, probably all of us, that there was Russian interference. And the Facebook episode does demonstrate that the Russians were trying to create some element of destabilization, some element of polarization in the American society. We do not know for sure, as George indicated, why they were doing it and what their ultimate objectives were. But I have a question to both of you. Was it a surprise? Should it be a surprise? I thought that for a number of years it was next to inevitable that Russia would retaliate in some way in terms of interference in American domestic affairs, because they were complaining that we were interfering in theirs. And Senator Cardin, Benjamin Cardin, who is one of the greatest critics of Russian interference today, he is one of the founding fathers of Russian interference in our affairs, because he was a very strong spokesman, a very enthusiastic spokesman for the United States doing more and more to change the nature of the Russian political process. And again, I want to go to what Eric said. It's quite clear that you can make a strong case that it's okay for us to interfere in Russian domestic affairs because we wanted to bring democracy to Russia. And it is not okay for them to interfere in American affairs because they're messing with real democracy. But you said that we're in a kind of warfare business with Russia. And when you're in warfare business, you kind of assume that if you do something to them, they would want to do something to us. And what is quite remarkable, to me at least, to what extent some people on the Hill, starting with Senator Cardin, were not thinking about predictable implications of the actions. Where am I wrong?
Eric, please.
Well, I think there's surprise in their surprise. For those of us who were students of Russian tradecraft, were we surprised that they did this and how they did this? I would say no. My own personal, speaking only for myself, I was a little surprised that they didn't hide their hand as much as they did. And that made me suspect that there could have been a quid pro quo. There's no point in poking a finger in someone's eye when you're responding to them poking it in your eye if you don't let them know it was you poking, right? So I think that is a strong hypothesis that I think has to be looked at. But at another level strategically, I do think that we have short corporate memories, shorter than the Russians for certain things. Our administrations and policymakers tend to turn over much more rapidly. And I think that they do forget when in Russia they don't. And I wanted to say, getting back to the point of are we at, quote, war with Russia, again, my view of the Russians is that if they're going to go to war, they want to weaken an opponent long before. So to them, the distinction between war and not war is not the same as the distinction that we have. George.
Well, I think it's never a wise idea to tell your boss he's wrong. So in this particular case, I agree. But in this particular case, I actually agree. I think this is not surprising what has gone on. In fact, it would be surprising were the Russians not to do things here that they believe we're doing there. And I think Eric is correct here. There's no point in doing that unless you're not looking to bargain at all. If you're not looking to change our behavior, then you do want to hide your hand. You want to do things that will hasten our demise, and you want to cover your tracks precisely for the reason that you highlighted, which is it would probably evoke a kinetic response, which Russia doesn't want to get into for obvious reasons. It's not a fight that they're going to come out well from. So all of these are reasons why I suspect what we've got here is a situation where the Russians are looking to change our behavior. They don't like what we've been doing. They have been trying to argue us into changing, pleading, complaining, delivering lists of grievances for many years with not much to show for it. And I think they have moved into a situation where they're strong enough and capable enough to push back in the hope that that will get our attention. And they've certainly gotten our attention now. There's no question about that. The next question is, have they gotten the attention of a country that doesn't recognize these nuances between war and peace, that thinks you're either a friend or you're an enemy, but those areas in between are difficult for us to cope with. And I think there's a danger that we could overreact, regard this as some sort of declaration of war, read more into their intentions that are actually there, and find ourselves in a very dangerous situation as a result.
Ambassador Burt. We have a mic. Yes.
Thank you. I have really two interrelated questions to ask both of you. And the first is, I understand that in one way or the other, in undertaking these various activities, the Russians have been trying to send a message. Maybe, as Dmitry argues, it's, we can play this game too. We can try to tamper with your internal politics and so forth. But have they made, do you think they've made a fundamental mistake by misunderstanding the kind of, say, the kind of current semi-hysterical nature of American politics, in that there has been a ferocious counter-reaction to this? It's breathed new life into both the hawks on the Republican side, as well as given the Democrats a new rationale for going after the Russians. And if so, does this provide us an opportunity, as George was suggesting, to maybe work out a new understanding along the lines of non-interference? And secondly, in terms of their information activities, I guess the question I have is, how did they fairly quickly, if you follow George's scenario, how did they get so good at this? I mean, Hillary Clinton, in her interviews now after her book was published, has even suggested that to be able to kind of fine-tune their information activities to target certain states that were kind of strategic in terms of the election, she's actually suggested that they needed some sort of American political strategy advice on how to engage effectively along these lines. And if George is right that the people doing this kind of stuff are sort of potentially unemployed people in St. Petersburg, that's not the same as a high-priced Washington lobbyist. So why have these activities on their part been apparently pretty effective, given the fact that, at least in my experience with the Russians, their understanding really of grassroots American politics is not very acute?
George, perhaps you first this time.
Well, first of all, I'm not sure how effective the Russian efforts actually have been. It's a very hard thing to assess. And oftentimes what you'll get is what you might call volumetrics. How many people might have seen the messaging? And then you end up with headlines like, oh, 10 million people may have seen the Russian, $100,000 worth of ads, 10 million people potentially saw it. The problem with that is it's one thing to know that someone potentially could have seen something. It's another thing to know they actually looked at it and read it, and those two frequently are very much out of line. And then it's yet another thing to know that you've actually affected the views, the audience that you're looking at. That's an even harder thing to know. So I think we ought to be very cautious about approaching that question of how effective these things are. The second question, though, really is how sophisticated really was this campaign, and how much depth of knowledge about the American political system is necessary to do what they did. And obviously there are many people out there that believe this was highly sophisticated, required a very nuanced understanding of U.S. politics to do. I'm not persuaded that that's really true. First of all, micro-targeting of an audience. If you're going to buy Twitter and Facebook ads, you have to micro-target your audience. That's what they're built to do. They have pull-down menus. When you're going to build an advertising campaign and buy something, you've got to select who you want to put these in front of. So it not only makes it easy to micro-target, those platforms actually require micro-targeting of the advertising in order to work. That's number one. Number two, it doesn't take a lot of depth of understanding of the U.S. political system to identify swing states. And even within those swing states, it's not very hard to figure out what the swing districts are. I have heard it said that the Russians couldn't possibly have known who to target within these swing states. All of that information is readily available. You can go to any one of a number of data brokers that are out there that sell this information. I can buy voter lists complete with all kinds of information about who, where they're registered, whether they voted, and all kinds of demographic information that goes along with it. So could the Russians have purchased all that or stolen it fairly readily from any of the companies that have this? Absolutely. It's not hard to do.
Yeah, I just have a short summary of what George said. Who taught the Russians was Facebook and Twitter with pull-down menus.
Yeah.
That's the short answer to your question. But I think the larger issue is, was this effective? And you have to ask, who was the intended audience and what was the intended effect? And we haven't talked much about the Russian population itself, which I think is something we should think about. Someone said all politics are local, meaning when you look at someone's, yes, when you look at a foreign policy and you're seeing a change in behavior and aggressive behavior, the first thing you look at is what's going on inside that country that might motivate a lean forward foreign policy. And so I think you have to say that part of the audience for this whole thing is the Russian population. And what effect do they want to have on them? And what was the effect on them? I think that's I don't know a lot about that. I haven't studied that, but I suspect that's a very important question in terms of if I'm Vladimir Putin and I wake up in the morning, what's the first thing I think about? I think he does think a lot about what's going on inside of his country. And then I think also the rest of the audience is the rest of the world, because this is projecting power. You know, our Navy does a show of force or show the flag. We go to different ports. You could view this as a cyber showing of the flag across the world to send a certain message about this a navy of cyberspace, if you will.
The Great White Fleet.
Yes.
We have Susan and then Eisenhower, and then we'll go over here. The mic is right behind you.
Right there.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Well, this is This is a fascinating presentation by both of you. I have one observation request for your perspective, and then also a genuine question here. But $100,000 as an ad buy doesn't sound like much money to me. I was told the other day by a cyber expert, so this is not my figure, it was his, that the Trump campaign spent $90 million on their digital advertising. If the Russians spent $100,000, we are talking about small potatoes. I mean, almost not even a blip. So that I'd be interested to know from your perspective whether that might influence where in the food chain this might have occurred. Secondly, Dr. Haseltine's mentioned a number of times the fact that it was so obvious that the Russians had done it. I would just like your comments on whether there's any scenario in which it could have been somebody else pretending to be Russian. And if so, do we have any way of going to deeper and deeper levels to figure out the answer to that question? Thank you.
Could it have been a false flag operation? Yes. Was it likely a false flag operation? I don't think so.
Any comment on the ad buy?
Well, I've read a lot about the ad buy, and one of the more amusing ones that it was a training exercise for new kids at the Institute. Here's $100,000, go have fun and learn. And, you know, the world is really weird, and stuff like that is entirely possible. But I think you also have to acknowledge that the 100,000, a lot of people think it was the tip of the iceberg. Right? The Russians are very good at, in denial and deception, at distraction. Look over here, says the magician, while I'm doing the real stuff over here. So if you take what I've said, that they can be very good at hiding their hand, you have to entertain the possibility that this is, oh, we only did 100,000 when we may have spent millions in ways that you did not know. You have to entertain that as a possibility.
George?
Yeah, I agree absolutely. If we assume that $100,000 is the limit of what we've spent, then in fact that's not a very significant amount relative to the amount that was spent on the campaign. I think it's enough to say this wasn't patriotic hackers. You know, the Russian Carter community, the folks that are out there that are very good at messing around in the cyber domain are also very stingy about spending their own money on stuff. They like to steal money, they don't like to spend it. So I doubt that, I think we can safely rule out that this was a bunch of patriotic hackers that were at work here. It had to be somebody with connections to government money in some way. But I think it is a very legitimate point that this may not be the limit of what was actually spent.
What about the false?
Sorry.
Yeah, well, I think false flag is always possible. You always have to look at the deception hypothesis. But in this particular case, I doubt that that was what actually occurred.
Down here. Right there.
Again, thanks. Scott Shane from the New York Times. I've been writing about some of this stuff, and I put a couple of paragraphs in each story that I think you may be questioning, at least George may be questioning, and that is what seems like a fairly rational explanation for all of this, which is I'm Putin. I saw some pretty big demonstrations against me in 2011. I blamed Hillary Clinton for those. You know, whether that was sincere or delusional, who knows. I'm you know, worried about the near abroad. I've got trouble in various, you know, in Ukraine and Georgia and Estonia. I mean, you know, I feel like that's my backyard. I should control that. And so by damaging, I mean, the theory that you hear is that by damaging the U.S. brand, the U.S. image, by making the U.S. look like a very divided, gridlocked place, all tangled up in all kinds of disputes over immigration, race, etc., that Putin can, you know, effectively turn to Russians or Georgians or Estonians and say, you know, you may not like us, but that's certainly not much of a model for you. So why isn't that a rational explanation for this whole program, and and frankly, fairly clever, fairly effective, or maybe at a small scale, but to exploit those divisions, doesn't that make a lot of sense?
Well, I certainly agree with you that the Kremlin wants to take any kind of evidence of dysfunction in the West, in the world's showcase democracies, and use that for internal propaganda purposes. They certainly want the Russian population to say, we've got it pretty good here. We certainly don't like what we're seeing over there. No doubt about it. Where I might offer a somewhat more nuanced position would be on whether the Russians think they have to actually stoke that dysfunction in order for it to serve that purpose. I think there's plenty of material for them to work with already.
Eric, anything
I can't
to
add to that.
All right. Jacob and then Don. So Jacob Heilbrunn, the editor of the National Interest.
Thanks, Paul. My question is fairly simple. Both panelists, but Eric Haseltine in particular, have been talking about the Russians. Who are the Russians? Are we talking about, when we're talking about this episode, are we talking about the FSB, the military, the Gerasimov doctrine? Are we talking about Putin steering this from the Kremlin, or giving his blessing to it, vaguely aware of what's going on? I was just wondering if we get a little more specificity.
Boy, I don't know that there's anything I'm allowed to say that would be constructive on that. I would just say this, that I think that if you have the idea that an organ of state security, as the Russians like to refer to them, is doing things that Putin found out about after the fact, you would probably be in error. I don't think it's, I think his command grip, as we say in the military, over those organs is good. And so if you see them behaving, and to some degree, the question I would put back to you is, does it matter? Right? Does it matter whether it was GRU, FSB, SVR, or the Presidential Protection Group, or any of these institutes that are affiliated with the government? I'm not sure that it does matter. There is an interesting complexion to your question, though, in that in America we tend to cleanly differentiate between the government and other non-governmental things like organized crime. And our intelligence service is an organized crime, although some people would say they're not as separate as they should be. In fact, they are. In Russia, not so much, right? So I think a fascinating question is, to what degree has organized crime in Russia had a hand in this as a proxy, and what is that relationship? I think that is an interesting question. It's not the question you asked, but it's the question I'm answering. Well, the Russians have a saying, может быть да, может быть нет. Yeah.
Maybe
yes, maybe no. I don't know, but I do think that, in particular, when you're looking at Russian cyber operations and you're looking at an officer who's conducting those, who are they working for? Rodina, Mother Russia? Yes. Their boss is going to get a cut of something. Maybe money can be made on this, and someone's going to make money. Maybe I'm going to make money. I think that their loyalties and their motivations may not be the same as the equivalent people we have doing these things. And we always in intelligence have to guard against mirroring. They're just a different version of us. Well, I'm here to tell you they're not.
I think this is an interesting question, and I think it does matter. Because it gets to the genesis of the activities and the intentions that might be behind them. And it affects how you react. What kind of policy response do we provide on our end? So I'll paint two different extreme pictures. The Russians may be a unitary, Kremlin-directed, personally Putin-directed operation where he started with a plan. This is what we want to do. Here's the plan. Here's who's going to do it. You all go out and play your part. That's one possible explanation for what we're seeing. Another is we've got some broad sets of instructions that are out there within Russia's special services. You've got collection priorities, influence operation priorities. You know broadly what you ought to be doing. Go do it and report back to me on your progress. And folks at the working level can go out and be somewhat entrepreneurial within those broad directives. Right? I know I want to collect information on what the plans of the Republican National Committee are and the Democratic National Committee are, and I want to understand how American voters are reacting to things. I'm going to go out and I'm going to collect information. I know I'm going to be rewarded for all of this. Now let's go beyond that and assume that some of the folks that are doing that are not just government staff who are wearing badges all day long. They're guys that are living in a gray world where they might work under contract for the government. They're hackers, and they've done some time doing organized crime things. They've done some carding. They've made some money. They've got some skills the government needs. Government has put them on contract to do some things, maybe sometimes in return for promising not to prosecute them for old transgressions. And they're going off doing this kind of stuff. And maybe during the evening, they're also doing carding, and they're trying to make some money to supplement their daytime activities. And they've got some pretty valuable information out there that they collected, and maybe they want to sell it to somebody, right? Maybe that somebody is WikiLeaks. I'm not saying that's what happened, but I'm saying that the question that you're getting to here is actually a pretty important one. It does matter who the Russians are, to what degree we're dealing with a kind of complex and confusing world there where it's not very clear who's who works for who, and how they ended up being directed, if at all, to do what they've done.
Let's go over here.
Hi, I'm Donald Smith. One question, actually I have two, but the first is, I've heard that Russia has engaged in information warfare with us since back to World War II. What's different about this time, and how much more intensive is it?
So I'm glad you asked that question, because I was hoping somebody would ask that. The Russians have been doing this kind of thing since well before World War II. I think dating into the Tsarist era, we can see a long tradition of not just propaganda, but disinformation, black propaganda, deception campaigns. And to some degree, you can look at this and say this is just a continuation of standard procedure on their part. But I would make the case that this is not just a continuation of things that they've long done. There are some new elements here that are important. One of the biggest new elements is technology. This is a lot easier to do than it used to be in the past. Never before could somebody use pull-down menus on a social media platform to micro-target messaging the way they're doing right now. We used to live in what you might call an information republic. I mean by that, the media was one where we had a handful of very prominent editorial staffs that decided what was newsworthy and what wasn't, what was true and what was not true. So you could rely on the New York Times and Washington Post and a handful of other national level newspapers to make those decisions and to put in front of readers. The same thing was true in the radio and television, content that they felt met certain standards. We're not there right now. We're in more of an informational democracy. It might be even a charitable description of it. There aren't those intermediaries that can help sort out what's newsworthy and what isn't, what's reliable and what isn't, what's fact-worthy and what isn't. And within that environment, one of the big challenges we face is that anybody can do the sorts of things that we're seeing here, and it's very hard for audiences to discern what the difference is between truth and fiction and what's attention worthy and what's not. And that is an element that I think matters a lot to what's going on right here. And it means that the nature of what the Russians are doing and the environment in which they're doing it has changed significantly.
Yeah, I just want to agree with you in the sense that I think we have had a paradigm shift, but I would refer to what the Russians themselves are saying on this subject. I've been reading a number of their leading thinkers on this, and you know, the Russians have a term translated says strategic task, meaning it's not a tactical victory on the battlefield, say in Ukraine, it's achieving a major policy objective. For example, to neuter NATO would be a strategic task in their minds. And their thinkers on this subject have recently been saying that we are now capable of achieving strategic tasks solely with information means. In the past, we required a combination of information means and warfare. Now we believe we can achieve everything we want just with information. And I think that is the one thing I think that is different about us, and I cautioned against mirroring. We tend to view bits as bullets or bits as intelligence. They, I think, more properly view bits as ideas. You cannot kill an idea with a bullet. You might be able to kill it with a different idea. And I think that they're more sophisticated in some ways in their thinking on this subject. And so I think that because of the lowered barrier to entry, which allows someone with an economy the size of Texas to punch above their weight, they now view that this is a strategic weapon on the same level as other strategic weapons.
Thank you. Paul, can I have a second question?
All right.
Sorry.
Sir.
I heard a lot of reasons why Russia's doing this, but I haven't heard that they wanted to get Donald Trump elected or not get Hillary Clinton elected. Is there any element to truth to either one of those?
I'm happy to let George take that one.
Well, I am, I would say, skeptical about the explanation that the Russians were looking to get Donald Trump elected or looking to hurt Hillary Clinton in particular. I don't doubt for a second that the Russians were not big fans of Hillary for all the reasons that I think have been elaborated. I do think that they looked at Trump as something of an unknown. They were certainly encouraged by some of the things he had to say about wanting a different relationship with Russia. I think they were encouraged by some of the things he said about rethinking our approach to democratization internationally, something that they've long wanted to see. But he was also very much an unpredictable element, and the Russians don't like unpredictability. They like things to be predictable. I also think that some of the things that have been attributed to Putin in his comments on Trump have actually been exaggerated or distorted. As far as I can tell, he said one thing about candidate Trump. He said it in response to a question at the end of a long press conference, so it was not a prepared statement, and his comments were actually mistranslated. He called him a colorful character. That got mistranslated as a brilliant character, which then turned into a genius, none of which was actually true. So the degree to which Putin actually intervened in commenting on the election, I think, has been vastly overblown.
Yeah, and to reinforce something George said earlier about looking at alternative hypothesis, you have to look at the other elements of the recent campaign, which are continuing to this day, whose intent one could glean as being to sow dissension and to, again, stress the latent cracks in our society. And so, viewed in that context, I think the sole goal of this campaign to elect Trump, it's hard to make that conclusion in my case.
All right. Anton Fedyashin from
Thank you.
American University.
Well, you've done my introduction, so thank you for a very this is the most entertaining panel I've been to because we've entertained so many different hypotheses here. I'd like to
Was
take
that a compliment or
if
I'm not sure that
take it as I would like to take advantage of having two experts here to ask about the American side of the story, because to be honest with you, I have rarely seen such a confused and chaotic response to what so many people say, well, some people say is an act of war, other people say is an unprecedented penetration of the very bastion of American democracy. So it started, I think we all remember, with the two reports that were, highly questionable in terms of the actual proof that they presented. We started with 17 agencies, and anyone who bothered pulling down the list would be surprised why the Coast Guard, for example, would risk its reputational integrity in supporting CrowdStrike's, conclusions, because that's January. Then was the 8th of May testimony on the Hill, when we find out from Clapper that it was actually 3 agencies and a hand-picked set of people who came to the conclusion. And there's a long list of, there's been a lot of chaos in the way the American intelligence community has been looking at this. So if this was as serious as some people claim it was, is this an embarrassment? And as opposed to the post-2003 weapons of mass destruction debacle, and I remember there was a lot of soul-searching in the intelligence community, and good came out of that. I don't see any soul-searching now. I may not be looking in the right place, but is there any soul-searching going on? And should there be a major overhaul of the U.S. intelligence community if this is truly as existentially damaging and threatening as many people claim it is? Thanks.
Well, I'd like to entertain a number of thoughts on that. First of all, I very much disagree that the intelligence community is in chaos on this. I have been inside the intelligence community at the highest levels. I was the Associate Director of National Intelligence at one time. And I was quite shocked at the unanimity across the community on this issue. I don't ever recall seeing that level of unanimity in my time there. I do not think there was chaos on it. I think there was pretty much consensus. The press likes to show conflict and chaos and turmoil because it's newsworthy, I suppose. But I really don't think that's the case. Should this cause a reorganization of the intelligence community? And I've lived through so many of those. I wouldn't think so. They rarely do any good. But you don't have to worry. Sooner or later, my old boss at NSA said, never throw away an org chart. They're all going to come back. So it's going to happen anyhow. Don't worry.
George, anything to add on that?
Well, I would certainly not want to use terms like embarrassing and chaotic to describe this. I would say, however, that based on what I've read about the process, and I'm relying largely on work that's been done in the Washington Post and New York Times, among others, it sounds to me as if the process was irregular, not the normal approach to this. So normally when you reach a national intelligence judgment of some kind, there's a National Intelligence Council umbrella under which that occurs. And there's a formal coordination process, and all the people that would reasonably have a role to play by virtue of their organizational responsibilities would be involved. It doesn't sound from the press reporting as if that was the way this was done. It sounds as if John Brennan in particular put together a task force, a small number of people from the 3 agencies that you had mentioned, and that they actually had to sign a non-disclosure agreement about the evidence that they were shown, but that evidence was not more widely disseminated throughout the broader intelligence community. That's a very unusual way to do this sort of thing. Now, I think the argument that I have understood that was made was that the sensitivity of the sources that were involved was so extraordinary that it required this. But I'm not aware of another topic that's been tackled in that way. So when I look at this and want to be confident myself that the judgments that were being reached allegedly with high confidence were approached in not just a methodologically rigorous manner, but through an organizational process that is very sound, I'm worried that perhaps that wasn't the case here.
All right, James.
So we talked about the Russians being mad at us for interfering in their elections with our democracy promotion efforts. I was under the impression those had kind of tapered off with some encouragement by Putin and his actions about non-governmental organizations. But could you, I mean, if there is a debate here to be had, you don't mess, you know, Putin says you don't mess in our internal affairs, we won't do yours. How much messing in their internal affairs are we still doing? Is there anyone can make any kind of clarity on that for me?
Well, I think one thing that I could say, and I haven't looked at it closely recently, but I think a lot of the money for that went away, if we're talking about open programs, you know, by not from coming out of the intelligence community, but what most people are kind of used to talking about and looking at. I think a lot of that went away during the Obama administration.
Does that mean nothing to bargain for then? They're doing this and they're asking us to stop doing something we've already stopped doing?
Well, I guess my response to that would be we just had a conversation about what we see versus what we don't see, and I expect they have similar conversations in Russia.
Yeah, I think, too, we have to look at the broader effects of this whole thing. Who has taken the narrative? You know, they have kind of taken the narrative, and we are all spending a tremendous amount of time on this that we aren't spending on other things. And I think that's something very important to think about. That is, I don't know if that was an intended effect, but that is certainly a powerful one.
We have one down here.
Thanks. Patrick Tucker with Defense One. So Russian destabilization efforts in Eastern Europe usually rely on a sort of partner within country. In Ukraine, for instance, Yanukovych, and then when Yanukovych was gone, you had deep inroads into the intelligence service there. And I wonder if we're having the right discussion about collusion. We're going to come to a legal understanding of what collusion looks like, but there's a lot of evidence now, very just historical fact, that the Russian embassy was very good at getting some people within the Trump campaign and the Trump government to compromise themselves. Michael Flynn clearly compromised himself. What discussion should we be actually having outside of whatever legal definition is reached later on collusion in order to better prevent people within the United States, and particularly within the United States government, from potentially compromising themselves and then actively colluding? Is this something that is as rampant, we think, it's not Ukraine, and Yanukovych is a different person, but what should we be talking about when we talk about collusion? Because we'll be talking a lot more about that, I think, in the coming months.
I don't know about you, George. I just don't feel qualified to answer that, honestly. I don't have any information at all that would inform me.
In terms of moving away from kind of gotcha type stuff, where should we begin to think about the health of a conversation that's sort of offline between two people, what its objective is? I mean, there's sideline tete-a-tete State Department stuff that can actually be very fruitful. Then there's stuff that feels a little bit more malignant. And where do you think, I don't know, how should we be talking about, in a very broad, abstract way? Yeah, exactly. In a very broad, abstract way. I'm not looking for you to say, oh, I know the guy that colluded, he's down the street. Like, in a very broad, abstract way, how should we be talking about collusion over the next year?
Well, I'm not sure how to answer that. There's classic intelligence recruitment where you're actually developing and ultimately paying a source to spy in some way, to conduct classic espionage. Obviously, we've got a lot of rules on the books about that already, which, as far as I can tell, are quite adequate for dealing with that problem. There's a second category where you might call unwitting agents, people that are doing things that the Russians want them to do, who are completely unaware of who might be on the other end that is helping them. That's the kind of thing that is in a gray area. And I'm not sure that you can very fruitfully legislate things that can prevent that sort of thing from going on. That's one where education and self-awareness sorts of things are probably best handled. And I would offer that an atmosphere in the country where people are afraid to talk to Russians is probably not something that's in our national interest. So that we've got to be careful in this area when it comes to collusion or accusations that people are doing Putin's bidding for him or advancing Russian interests in that sort of thing.
Okay, very quick follow-up, because I rambled so long, so now I've honed it on something more precise. What sort of education efforts, what form would that take in terms of helping people not be unwitting agents? Because you don't want to look hysterical, and you certainly don't want something at the highest level of government coming out saying to people, don't be an unwitting agent. And at the same time, it is a problem that you want to bring attention to. So how do you walk that balance between helping people understand what that looks like and not looking like you're an alarmist?
Well, I think the main point is that this is nothing new. I don't think that anything new is called for because we have a new situation. Guarding against foreign influence has been something that we've all been aware of for a very long time, and those of us who are inside the system get a lot of counseling on that and constant feedback and constant questions about our contacts and things of that nature. So I think that there's nothing in what's happened recently in my mind that would cause us to depart from common sense, which is people who are in positions to have sensitive information, whether in the political domain or not, need to know, as they always have, that it's the national security that's at stake, and they have to be very careful. And when they have interactions with foreign nationals, to always keep in the back of their mind that this may not be so innocent. And that's always been the case, and I don't see any need for changing anything based on what's happened recently, because this has been with us forever.
I'll just speak from my personal experience. I was a political appointee at the State Department in the Bush administration, and they hired me, and I went in for my first days, and there was a briefing on how to do this and how to do that, and there was a briefing on security, and it covered certainly many of these issues. And those are things that are typically repeated by the government on a periodic basis for all of the employees who might have access to information that someone else might find desirable. So I would certainly kind of align with what George and Eric said there. I would also point out on the question of foreign influence, we have outside the room, Dimitri knows my favorite president, George Washington, his bust. And if you go and read the farewell address, and you read the portion of the farewell address that deals with the question of foreign influence, it actually has two sides. One side is, you have to be very careful of allowing your affection, for another country to drive your policy, because that can distort your policy. But there's also another side, which is, you have to be careful to not to allow your antipathy toward another country to warp your decision-making process and to warp your thinking. And I think it's kind of a useful reminder for us to perhaps to think about this during this unusual time period that we're in. Now, we have one here, and then we'll come here.
Okay. Thank you. Eric Sharayev. I will be brief. Question at the statement.
From George Mason,
George Mason
University.
We know that KGB was giving enormous freedom of action compared to all Soviet agencies in the past, and they've been pretty creative in destroying, distorting, abusing, recruiting. We know that technologies have changed, and this was emphasized today many times, but still behind those technologies, I support my friend geeks at Palo Alto saying that there's always human beings. Maybe it's time, or maybe to what extent do you think it is time to go back and study the history books and examine our intelligence professionals, examine their experience and learn more about what KGB was doing then, just to learn again their habits and their skills and their motivations right there, as to use it today. To what extent? We understand things change, but maybe degree of that return what we want to know more about.
I think that's absolutely
I agree.
a good idea.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Short answers. Ma'am, please.
Oh, thanks. I'm Dana Priest with the Washington Post. So you both have said that what happened was more or less predictable, given what the Russians have been doing elsewhere. And you both have said that the IC was pretty much unified on what happened or what was happening. And if you look at what happened in Europe, you would know that it happened. It happens and is happening on social media as a platform. So it kind of relates back to Anton's question. If you were united, if it was predictable, if you knew the platform that it would be coming onto, why do the intel committees in Congress seem so surprised? And where is the defense? What is the IC or government as a whole doing to stop this? And again, given the fact that you knew it was coming on social media and you know what the restrictions on authorities would be, what is the defense?
Well, you've just opened what I think is a fascinating question, which is what role should the government, national security, intelligence, and other take in getting into what amounts to the private sector? Facebook is private sector. Twitter is private sector. There's some question about how much national security should get involved in guarding the IT of American businesses, given that it's possible that nation states are going up against some of them, as happened in the Sony case, right? And I think that it's very unlikely that you're going to see the government lean forward and get into the private sector and start, A, managing the messaging that happens in the private sector, and B, protecting the cybersecurity more than what Homeland Security and FBI are already doing. And it is a fascinating question about the difference in our societies. I would say that that same separation between the private and public is not true in Russia, that I don't think they would view it that way. And so I don't hold out much hope, nor do I think it's necessarily appropriate for our government to get into the business of determining what messages are and are not put out there in the public media.
So if I could just follow up with that. So we're not talking just about messages in any normal way. I mean, we're talking about it as an instrument to do something that you've already discussed is, either akin to war or it's achieving their political goal. So we know it's driven by a nation state to do us harm. Does that still mean?
Well, I want to come back to
something
that I think it was Wright, who writes for the New Yorker, in his play, My Trip to Al-Qaeda. He ends his play saying, Al-Qaeda cannot destroy America. Mm-hmm. Only we can do that. And so I think we have to look to ourselves, not necessarily our politicians, and how fractious we are. And I don't think that, I kind of look at it sort of like a bee sting and somebody having an allergic reaction that kills them, not the bee sting. It's what we do to ourselves. And I think sometimes people want to look to the government to do things which it's not appropriate for the government to do. I think we all have to look in the mirror and say, can we allow someone to do this to ourselves? It's us. It's how we react to this. It's how we're going to vote based on this. So I would turn the focus more to the American people than to their government.
George. Yeah, I'll second that, and I will add a couple of things. I think there is much that we can do and should do to ensure the integrity of actual balloting in elections. That, I think, is something that the government needs to be involved in. There's much that we can do practically. One very simple thing is to mandate the use of paper balloting backup systems so that we're all confident that when we have an election that those vote tallies are actually accurate. And relying on only electronic balloting under the cyber threat circumstances that we face, I think, is a very unwise idea. So it's not hard to do, it's not expensive, and that's a proper role for government, I think. When it comes to information, that I agree with Eric, that's a very, very precarious proposition to get into the business of policing content. And interesting, it's one where the Russians have long been claiming that information itself is a threat, that it can be weaponized, and we need to do something about this. They've been urging this on us for a long time. The Chinese have as well, and our reaction has been, no, no, no. You know, information yearns to be free. And we now, in the last year or so, have started to say, oh, wait a minute, maybe information can be dangerous. Maybe we need to do something about that. And I think it's a very, very dangerous thing for the government to be in that business. I'm not at all confident that we would do it well, and I think it would change the nature of who we are to do that.
Yeah, I just want to go back to the point about voting. I couldn't agree more. Whereas DEF CON, where hackers were given 30 of the voting machines that are now used in the United States, and within 45 minutes they'd hacked all of them.
You know, let me follow up a little bit on this conversation, and I'm going to go in a slightly different direction with it. But, you know, if you look at our media environment, if two big TV networks want to merge together and create some huge mega network, the government has an opinion on that. American people have an opinion on that. You know, there's kind of a monopoly, and you can have this much share and all this other kind of stuff. Are Facebook and Twitter just too big and too pervasive, and is part of the problem actually that they're sort of like monopolies in that space?
Well,
and I recognize that's a very, I mean, that's a pretty challenging question.
Well, you know, it is interesting that technology moves faster than policy and law. And so we have a new technology, social media, which has created a new currency, social information. And that currency is like a commodity that can be monopolized. My own view is, being very close to the web and internet and being kind of a digerati of a sort, is that in the end, information will out. I think that there are so many ways that the barrier to entry has made anybody able to broadcast to a large number of people and in return hear from large numbers of people. Norm Pearlstein said, media is moving from one to many to many to many. So I, for one, do not believe that we're in any danger of having someone monopolize information. I think everything is kind of going in the opposite direction fast.
Agreed.
All right, okay, so much for that idea. We have one over here. Dave Majumdar.
So I was going to just ask, what is the ultimate goal for the Russians here? I mean, I guess it was kind of alluded to, I guess you mentioned it earlier, that they kind of want this mutual non-interference pact. This seems to be kind of like a thread that they've kind of been on since the Soviet era even. I mean, during détente, Brezhnev mentioned this, and that doesn't seem to have changed. Is that ultimately what they want here, or some sort of non-interference pact, and also like just like respect to mutual interests and whatnot? Is that still ultimately their goal?
Well, I think that's at least one of their goals, yes. I think there are probably some others that go along with that. But I think that goal in particular is one that we ought to test and call their bluff, so to speak, and see if they're in fact serious about pursuing it. If they are, I think it's very much in our interest to do that. It's not going to prevent messing about in our political system. I think that's probably going to happen one way or the other, but I think it could take some of the sharper edges off of that. minimize the dangers and ensure that this doesn't get out of hand.
And my main comment is, again, I'll return to the domestic perspective on this inside Russia in terms of what their goal is. I have to believe that very near the top of their list is to somehow use this to consolidate their own stability of under the sea and Putin and his group. And I think in some sense it may have done that because the potency, again, I want to go back to, they have taken the narrative. Here we are talking about them. And so if I'm Putin, I can go and say, look, we, with an economy the size of Texas, are completely dominating the American discourse. And that really, in a way, that makes him look pretty strong and not someone you want to mess with inside of Russia. So I think that's always what we need to keep in mind. We're so focused on ourselves, but he wakes up in Russia.
So in other words, strike a blow at Putin by not talking about him so much.
Yeah. You know, actually, I think that is a good idea.
Thank you very much. I think that was our last question. So thank you very much, all of you, for joining us this afternoon. I think we had a terrific and very enlightening conversation. So thank you.
That was really